Hello, everyone. My name is David Ackerman. I serve as the conference minister of the Penn West Conference of the United Church of Christ. I'm also a board member on Insurance Board, and I'm grateful to Insurance Board for having me on today's webinar. We are here today with Dean Rocco, an attorney from Wilson Elser, to discuss some trending human resource topics for ministries in 2022. Dean, it's good to see you this afternoon. Over the last couple of years, ministries have adapted every aspect of their operations in order to continue serving their communities. And human resources is a major area that churches have run into during this time. So we're going to address some of the trends that Insurance Board is seeing, and we're going to ask Dean to offer some legal guidance so that he can help our churches navigate some of these issues. And Dean's coming to us from Los Angeles, California today. You can see the beautiful background, the sunny weather. Here where I'm at in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, we've got snow. Dean, it looks like you've got some Emmy Awards next to you too, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, we're actually shooting a thank you or an acceptance speech for a number of awards that we've recently won in partnership with MindMeld Learning. It's our online programming for sexual harassment, human trafficking, programs like that we put out for businesses and organizations to keep compliant with all the employee training. So I guess we're going to use it as the backdrop because there's like a cloud in the sky in Los Angeles. So I can't give you like the super pretty Los Angeles that we typically have. So we'll give you some shiny awards instead.
That sounds perfect. Thank you. Let me ask you, Dean, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so for folks that haven't seen me on an Insurance Board program before, I am stationed here in Los Angeles, but I'm a chair of our labor and employment practice group, which spans all across the country with offices and lawyers all over the place. And in that capacity, we're helping folks with day-to-day employment law issues, helping them manage risk when they're disciplining employees, hiring employees, signing executive comp agreements. I know that's one of the things that we talked about maybe hitting today, written contracts that you have with your folks. And then when things go south and litigation ensues, we litigate those for clients all across the country.
Well, that's very helpful, and we appreciate all that you do for Insurance Board and for our churches. Thank you for all of that.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to call everyone on the webinar's attention to the fact that we welcome chat questions that you may have as we proceed. If you want to put your questions in chat, we'll do our best to respond to those at the end of today's webinar. So Dean, I'd first like to ask you to comment on something. I understand that we've had in a number of states some changes in legislation regarding human resources. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these changes and maybe provide us with some guidance on why ministries need to stay in compliance with them?
Sure. And certainly for folks that are with me here in California, it's a particularly acute issue because California can't help itself. It has to pass 10, 15 laws every year that impact employers. And it's it's a challenge to keep up with it. Some other states are a little bit less active. They tend to rely a little bit more on the federal statutes and what's going on there. But every year, an organization should be looking in October, November, December to see what's changed. That's sort of when the legislative calendar comes to a head, bills get signed into law, and they typically are effective January 1 of the year. So right now in January of 2022, it's a perfect time for organizations to be looking at what's come out and how it impacts them. At a federal level, there may be some things, but as you mentioned, there's a lot of different things that are happening at state levels. Here in California, we had a slew of statutes that did anything from changing the family medical leave obligations and rights for employees in the state to limiting and changing the way employers could word separation agreements, settlement agreements with their employees as they're leaving. We've had a number of states, Montana and New York come to mind, where there's been legislation around cannabis use, and there's been legalization statutes that have been going into effect. And some of those legalization statutes have conferred employee benefits or rights to off-duty use. And so you may have a drug use or a drug testing policy, that you have to look at and say, is this still legal? In other states, North Carolina comes to mind, there's been an expansion in what it means to be a protected category or what a protected characteristic looks like. So there's been an expansion in the type and kinds of people that are protected from discrimination. And again, those are things that you need to breathe into your policies and procedures and be wary of as you're going throughout the year and making those sort of decisions. And I would really urge folks on this conference to be asking yourself, do we have a handbook in place? And if so, what's it look like? And when's the last time anybody looked at it? And take these opportunities annually to update them. These are really important, not only for you to have this sort of a benchmark, but also to communicate, particularly large organizations where you start having layered management. Those are not only tools for your employees, but for your managers to go back and say, do we have a policy on this? What does it say? What do I need to do here? And do I need to partner with somebody in a business role or an HR role to help me move forward with a particular disciplinary issue or a medical leave issue, whatever the case might be.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I want to ask you a question. Over the past couple of years, it's been a very different world, right? I want to address, from Los Angeles to Greensburg to everywhere in between and beyond, we have been dealing with issues of COVID-19, and it's been really difficult for churches to kind of keep up with the ever-changing information that's been shared surrounding policies, surrounding the disease, vaccine mandates, masking policies, all of this sort of stuff. Dean, can you give us an update on what's happening right now, and tell us if you can give us some guidance on what our church's best practices, what we can do? That would sure be helpful.
Yeah, so I'll answer this like a lawyer and say it's 11:30. No, we're here in January of 2022. Anything that we say is subject to change tomorrow. But currently, the legal challenges to the vaccine mandates for federal contractors and employers of more than 100 or more employees have made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Or I should say, a circuit court for the federal contractors, the Supreme Court for larger employers of 100 or more, and the Supreme Court for healthcare employers that are participating in Medicare and Medicaid. The federal vaccine mandates at this point have all been struck down, and OSHA and other organizations are regrouping to see what they may do in the wake of these rulings. But currently, there is no top-down federal mandate that requires most of the folks that are going to be watching this broadcast to impose a mandate on their employees. Now, that is not to say that any of these viewers couldn't do that. The law still permits you to have a vaccine mandate if you want to do that. And if you impose it, there should be a layer of exceptions for religious or medical exemptions. And we could talk, and we have talked before about sort of what those look like. And I'd refer any of the viewers to the Insurance Board's COVID informational page to look at stuff that we've done in the past about vaccine mandates and employer promulgated mandates. Those are still good. The law is still good there. It's permissive if you want to do it. Beyond the vaccine mandates, which have been a real big hot button issue over the last year or so since we've had the vaccines available, there's just general COVID and pandemic related prevention efforts that an organization, whether you're a religious organization or a restaurant or a hotel or a manufacturing warehouse, everybody needs to be thinking about these things. And so even though the news of the day is the Supreme Court's overturned some of this stuff, and people may be thinking, there's an opportunity to be lax. That's really not the case. Organizations still need to be looking at where are our risk factors, where are the high touch areas, where do we need to be doing cleaning, and then looking also at your state and local requirements to see, is there anything that a Department of Public Health or a state agency is requiring us to do to fold that into our planning. And again, I would refer folks here to some of the stuff that we've done for Insurance Board. All those videos are available online at the Insurance Board site. And we've actually gone into a church in Northern California and shot a really nice piece and walked through some of the things that organizations can be thinking about when they're looking at how they protect their employees, their volunteers, and the folks that come in to their organizations for worship.
So just to clarify, you mentioned the Insurance Board website, which is www.insuranceboard.org. I do want to mention, is there a worksheet for churches that, in terms of helping to build a policy that may be found there, and or a model policy? Can those things be found on that site as well?
Yes, there is a lot of stuff on the Insurance Board's COVID site specifically. And it ranges from videos that we've put together over time, updating folks on what the current law is. There's a lot of handouts, resources that folks can use, checklists, policies. Really, it's free of charge. It's one of the benefits of being a member. And it's a great risk management tool that we really need people looking at and want people looking at. So please go visit the site and see it there. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. I've heard that some churches are running into issues relating to disability and leave management. Can you share with us what you're seeing and what ministries can do to protect themselves in terms of disability and leave management?
Yeah, so, and I probably have mentioned this to viewers before if they've seen me on other programs for Insurance Board. It's something that I bring up a lot because frankly, since the advent of the Family Medical Leave Act, which is a federal statute, we've seen states like California and others adopt their own state plans. And we've seen even local government agencies getting involved in paid leave, paid sick leave statutes. All of these sort of form, if you want to picture in your head, concentric circles, and there's overlap. Sometimes you'll have a person that's on workers' compensation and you've got a workers' comp law that's covering them, but the injury also puts them into a protected category and provides them leave of absence under a federal or a state statute, depending on where you are and how big you are. And there might even be another circle that sort of overlaps that, there may be a paid leave, a paid sick time benefit that's available under state or local law. So it's a complicated area. And it's one that we've seen not only the laws and the rights and the benefits that are available to employees expanding, but on the back end, we've seen incrementally over the course of years, the litigation numbers going up year to year to year. And if you look at the statistics in most places, you'll see that disability and leave management ends up being higher as a form of discrimination than almost any others outside of retaliation, which ends up being attached to almost any lawsuit. So it's sort of a carry-all to any other sort of discrimination claim. So it's one that people really need to pay attention to. And unlike discrimination based on race or national origin or religion, where the model tends to be manager or company doesn't like somebody because of their blank, and they fire somebody, they write them up or whatever, there's a very clear intent involved. Disability and leave statutes get violated every day because people just don't understand them. It's not, I don't want to go after David because I don't like the fact that he's disabled. What ends up happening is people just don't know that they have these obligations, and they give David a little bit of time off and they try to work with David, and they get to a point where they have staffing shortages, or they got to just move in a different direction to cover themselves. And maybe they bring somebody else in, and they're not doing it because they don't like David or his religion or any protected category that David might be a part of. They're just trying to cover their business and sort of miss the basics of disability and leave management and leave themselves open to litigation. So I really would urge folks, sort of going back to the start here, look at what statutes are applicable to your organization, look at what policies you have in place. And then beyond that, what forms do you use? If you're having conversations with employees, about time off, do you have a document that you send to the employees to request the information? Do you have a standard medical certification that your employees provide you from their doctor that gives you the information you need to make informed decisions? And do you have a form that you send out to employees to say, thank you for letting us know, David, you're covered by a disability discrimination statute. We're going to engage in an interactive process, and we're going to offer you the following as an accommodation, or you're covered by the Family Medical Leave Act, and we're going to provide you some time off under that statute, and click off all the boxes and document what you're doing, not only to educate you and the employee about what's going on, set those expectations so people aren't confused, but also document that you're following the law. So it is a very important area that employers need to be thinking about. And I really do think it's something that you got to go just back to the drawing board and make sure that you have those building blocks in place to be successful on a day-to-day basis when they come up.
Boy, that's really important and well said. Thank you. I imagine that the pandemic has made this even more complicated, correct?
Oh, yes. And it's gotten easier maybe in the last, say, 6 months or so. Add another concentric circle, maybe at the beginning of this pandemic, when you had all of the pandemic related leave, the supplemental leave, the paid supplemental leave that was coming down from a federal level, and certainly a lot of states adopted their own programs. A lot of that has shifted and has waned away, but you do still have pockets where you'll have state or local obligations to provide people time off to go get tested, to provide time off to go get vaccinated, to provide time off to treat for COVID-19. And so as you're looking at all of the things that may be applying to you, that's another area in a pocket that you just need to be looking to your left and to your right and saying, what's available at a federal level? Probably not much at this point. What is the state requiring us to do? And is there anything in a local jurisdiction where our employees are located that we need to be pulling into this equation?
Thank you. That's very helpful. And I assume, by the way, remember, please, to put your questions in chat if you have questions along the way. I assume that this new information also means that leadership and staff should review and update their policies in our churches. And can you speak to the importance of making sure that such policies stay current and reflect any changes in legislation?
Yeah, so I just to repeat a little bit of what I said before, I really think it's important from a health check standpoint for an organization to go through that process, because when you walk through and you set those policies and procedures and you set that baseline, sometimes you realize, oh boy, we're not doing that right. And then you got to make some changes to your practices. But even assuming that doesn't happen, you then establish those baselines that you can go to your employees and your staff and train them on them. And you provide that level of communication to the people that should be implementing those things. And then you also communicate that to employees, and you communicate your expectations and those rights to those employees so that they can communicate with you. All of that is very important in terms of just managing some risk and avoiding some litigation or claims that you don't need to have, just because you're communicating with your employees what your expectations are, they understand what the policies and procedures are, and they can comply with them, and things run a little bit more smoothly. But certainly on the back end, when litigation arises, without exception, I can tell you that every plaintiff's lawyer across this country, when they file a lawsuit against you, their set of discovery, the interrogatories and the document requests that they ask you for, are going to include what's your handbook, what's your policy, and what did you do to communicate that to employees and your management. And if you don't have a handbook, if you don't have policies and procedures, and you're not communicating what your expectations are to your employees and to your managers, it doesn't take a lawyer to explain how that's going to look to a jury. It gives the appearance that you just don't make it a priority. And most plaintiffs' lawyers will hit you over the head with that, and they'll turn to a jury and say, David doesn't really care about these issues. David doesn't really care about medical leave. This church doesn't really care about these issues. They don't really care about compliance. They're now telling you because I sued them, my client sued them. But if they really cared about it on the front end, they would have taken these steps to do A, B, C, D. So it really is a tool that can be used as a shield or a sword when litigation arises. To take the flip side of it, obviously, if you have all that in place, if you've communicated it to your managers, if you gave the employee the forms that they needed to fill out to get a leave of absence and they didn't follow the process, you get to flip that the other way around and say, this is the employee's fault. We tried to do the right thing. We communicated our expectations. We gave them the opportunity to do these things, and they just didn't follow through on their end. And they didn't come to us and let us know that they had a concern, even though we had these policies, even though we had an open door policy, even though we communicated to them that we wanted them to come forward. So you can see how it works both ways. But the key is just getting it in place in the first place so that you have those baseline standards, those baseline expectations in place. You can train your employees on them. And then, as we said before, and it's worth repeating, every year or so, just go back to them. Is there anything major that needs to be implemented or changed? And then make those changes on a going forward basis.
Well, speaking of keeping current with changes, with so many staff now working remotely or in a hybrid fashion, how important is it for churches to have a remote work agreement? Boy, before Zoom, we would never have had something like this, right? But how important is something like this for churches to have for their employees?
Yeah, the paradigm's really shifted. I can remember before the pandemic, a lot of conversations with employees, even then, about wanting to work remotely, and employers pushing back on it, saying, we're not technologically set up to do this. We feel that it's important for our employees to be around each other and their supervisors for supervising their work. And we're not going to make exceptions to those rules. And then everything was forced to change. And we now live in a totally different reality where, at least socially and in the world around us, there's this notion that employers should be able to do more of that. And the question then becomes, what's your environment going to look like on a going forward basis? And on the one hand, I think it's very important to have these sort of policies and procedures. So you set the expectations with the employees about how you want them behaving in that universe, provided it's going to exist beyond the pandemic. How do you want them clocking in and out? How do you want them communicating with their supervisors? It seems pretty obvious, but just reiterating that from 9 to 5, and except for when you're taking breaks, you should be doing work, not walking your dog or watching, daytime television, or, working on a side project, a personal matter, whatever the case might be. All of those things are very important to sort of communicate to employees how the environment's going to work, but then also there's some important risk mitigation that organizations need to be doing if employees are going to have access to personal information about parishioners, financial data, donations, contact information, personal contact information. How do you want that treated? Do you want people taking steps to protect that? Most organizations are going to have obligations to do that when they're inside the office. How do you transition that when employees start having access to that outside from another server, where you could have sort of weak spots in your cybersecurity? So think about that, and then breathe that into the policy. And then also, I sort of mentioned wage and hour before, but in a typical workplace setting, you've got the opportunity to see, is Bob sitting at his desk working? Is Jane here taking her lunch break? When people are in a remote setting, a lot more trust has to be put in place, and you have to rely on employees to really do the right thing. And you need to communicate some expectations around those wage and hour pieces. And then you really have to, on the back end, this is really not so much about the remote policy per se, but I would just add in that employers really should be doing something on a routine basis to audit and check to see if things are happening the way that they expected and communicated that they should be happening. Do you really have records that people are taking those meal periods? Are people really logged off, or are you getting emails from your employees while they're on lunch, presumably? And does that really not jive with what should be happening? So some auditing there. And then finally, give some thought, going back to the policy question that you asked, David, give some thought to whether or not you are reimbursing employees for the expense that they're incurring working remotely. So it is a bit of a jurisdiction issue, but some places have taken a more aggressive stance on what employees should be reimbursed for when they're working remotely. whether it's, if they're using home Wi-Fi, if they're using home computers, if they're using their own electricity, if they're using their personal cell phones, the more stuff that they're paying for out of their own pocket that they're now using for work that they weren't before raises more of the specter that an employer may in a particular jurisdiction need to be reimbursing that. So that should be part of your policy. And if you determine that you're going to reimburse that, or the law requires you to reimburse that, give some thought to how you're going to reimburse that and then communicate it. Maybe it's a monthly stipend, maybe people are turning in receipts, but you're going to want to communicate that to your employees as well.
So as a conference minister, I hear what you're saying, and a lot of our church workers are like not really 9 to 5 kinds of people who punch in and punch out. We do have, and every now and then I will have employment concerns raised, considering someone like a custodian or a music director or something like that. But for the most part, most of the employment concerns I have are with church's primary employee, and that's the pastor. And there are times when churches make decisions about pastoral terminations without really consulting like they should their constitution and bylaws, or even the call agreements that they have with their pastors. And churches may be quick to terminate pastoral relations, I find, without not only without regard to these, but also without having any kind of sort of healthy assessment process for pastoral evaluation. I don't know if there's some thoughts that you have that could speak to these, but again, these are kind of different than a sort of 9 to 5 type of job, as you were mentioning earlier. So I welcome your thoughts.
Yeah, that's not unique to religious organizations. This is stuff that every type of industry needs to do right, and oftentimes you find a lot of folks struggling to do it right. You've identified sort of a fork in the road between at-will employees who, in most jurisdictions, can be terminated at any time, with or without cause, with or without reason. You don't need to provide them any sort of notice. Obviously, you can't do it for illegal reasons, like they complained about some illegality or because of their race. But otherwise, you can let them go without much notice. On the other side, if somebody is contracted and they've got a written agreement in place that provides things like a notice provision, how much time needs to be provided in advance of a termination, or if it says an individual will only be terminated for certain reasons, or if it authorizes terminations for certain reasons, those folks have a much different look and feel, and you need to take a much different approach to managing risk around those folks. Now, I would say in either event, you should have a reason for letting somebody go. But when you're talking about your pastors, folks that are parties to a contract or a call agreement, you need to be asking some much more detailed questions about what is it that we're concerned about? Is that grounds for termination under the agreement? Is there anything that would prevent us from moving forward? And have we acted in good faith pursuant to whatever sort of provisions might be in existence in our contract to give the individual the fair opportunity to perform, and if not, then give them the proper notice to be terminated. So those contracts really should be a guidepost, and you need to be looking at them, not when you get sued and you say, hey, Dean, here's the contract, you figure it out. Those agreements need to be looked at when the performance issues come up for the first time, and you decide this is not going in a direction that we're comfortable with, and we need to start having conversations about performance, not the day of the termination, not at the time of the termination, not after the termination, well in advance, so that you can make sure that you've built a record of good faith, that you're complying with the contract's agreements. To the extent that it pulls in bylaws or other documents, you'd want to be doing that as well. But manage that risk throughout the process. And then sort of pulling away from those comments and just talking about whether you're dealing with an at-will employee or somebody that's a contracted a ministry leader who has a little bit more sophisticated rights. Managing risk in the disciplinary process is very important. I often tell people sue organizations for one of a couple of reasons. Either they're embarrassed and upset by a termination, or they're looking for answers, or they don't agree with it. All of these, well, sometimes there's nothing you can do. Somebody's going to sue you, but I would tell you that a vast majority of the terminations arise based on an employee not feeling like they were given a fair opportunity to perform, or being surprised by a termination, or not having an opportunity to say what really happened, and needing to go to a third party, namely a plaintiff's lawyer, to go find out that information. So there's that piece. And I would also say when employees do go to that plaintiff's lawyer's office, they'll either have their personnel file in their hand, or one of the first things that the lawyer is going to ask for from the organization is, I want to see Rick's personnel file. And then they're going to look at it. And if it's got an employment application and a termination notice, that's a huge red flag for them. But if they see warnings, conversations, performance management, and then a termination that ties it all together, that's going to make them ask the question, do I want to invest my time and money in a process where it looks like there's something going on there, and there's an employer that's at least on paper trying to give somebody a fair opportunity to perform, and I got to work through all of that to convince a trier of fact that this is not the real reason for the termination, it's something else that's illegal. So all of that really begs employers to be mindful and do this performance management on the front end. Talk to people about the performance issues that you're having, clearly communicate those expectations where they're not being met, and document these conversations. And there's a term called progressive discipline that floats around in the halls of human resources departments, and it's there for a reason. And what it sort of contemplates is, something that maybe not all that big of an issue starts with some conversations that grow into some warnings or final warnings that grow into a termination. But throughout that process, there's a documented performance management situation that's happening, and employees are given an opportunity to succeed. That's not to say if somebody walks in and has an argument with somebody and punches them in the face, that you have to give them a verbal warning, please stop punching people in the face. Obviously you can escalate it, and you would be able to do that in your policy, but you want to be able to have a process in place that allows you to do that performance management. And to sort of go back to where we started, when you're putting a handbook and a policy and procedure in place, that's something that you would lay out in your handbook. And you would say to people, we're going to try to engage in progressive discipline. And if you have an annual review process, you'd breathe it into that. But you'd also reserve the right to say, look, we're the arbiter of what's going to be a terminable offense, and we reserve the right to give you a warning or not, and to fairly spell out what the rules of engagement are going to be around that in your policy. And then lastly, you mentioned something, and I'm not sure if this is something that you meant to sort of pin on, but evaluative processes are really important in an organization. It doesn't need to be the only conversation you're having with your employees is when they're screwing up and when you're thinking about firing them. And quite the opposite's true. If you want professional development, most well-run organizations will be doing organizational development and working with their staff to figure out how they build them up and make them better at their positions on a going forward basis. So, each organization that's a party to this program should be thinking about, do we do that? And as part of that evaluative process, when you're talking about managing risk, these sort of things will come through. Oftentimes when I get a really thick personnel file and I get a story about, something happening, employees will only look at the very positive part of those evaluative processes. And, David said I was doing a pretty good job, but you often do see the little signs and the cracks forming in the foundation where somebody's not turning in particular reports, or they're not timely in the way they communicate with people, or they're gruff with people from the outside. And you can see the efforts to work with them through those evaluative processes as well. And then those grow into warnings as well. And you can say, even though overall you were doing okay at a particular point in your career, you can see the little warning signs of it that then grow into something that becomes greater. And it's all part of saying, we gave you a fair opportunity to succeed here, to build yourself within the organization, to be successful here. and this is what happened when we went in a different direction, and this is why we let you go.
Thank you. A couple of comments on that from a UCC perspective. Our MESA, Ministerial Excellence Support and Authorization Team, has produced a resource called Assure Foundation, where they have assessment processes for ministers and for churches in terms of assessment of ministry. Also, the call agreement template that the United Church of Christ has, my sense of it is that it is favorable toward employers, toward the churches, and I think it's important for ministers to note that, especially as they look at that template and as they sign these agreements and utilize those templates. It's just important, I think, for people to note, because sometimes ministers assume things that aren't actually in the agreement, and I think it's important when people look at agreements generally just to note what's said there. I also want to mention the EPL PAC Premier of Insurance Board that is free for all IB participants. This is a resource that includes instant free access to an online human resource center located at it's www.eplriskmanager.com. That's eplriskmanager.com. And there are risk management products and resources designed to help ministries manage their workforce and mitigate their exposure to employment-related claims that are found on this. All that's needed to access the site is an email address and your insurance board policy number. And once again, that's eplriskmanager.com. Anything else on Dean concerning termination situations that you would like to note before we shift gears one more time here?
We covered it pretty well. I guess I would reiterate what you said, because I know we've mentioned those call agreements before, and insurance boards reiterated the importance of looking at those and either using them or at least as a starting point for negotiations, using those documents. It's really important to get those in place. And then, the other thing that I would mention that maybe I haven't is for folks that sort of poo-poo what we're saying, I would say this: we live in an environment where employees are more educated about their rights and more likely to assert them than ever before. I mean, when you look at social justice movements over the last 2 years, you can see a very clear connection, particularly with younger employees, to identify issues, particularly, and it bleeds into the workplace where they view certain things in a certain way. And I would say, even if that's not what's going on, when you're managing risk through disciplinary processes, giving people a fair opportunity to perform, communicating with them about what your expectations are, that's a way to diffuse those sort of thoughts and really get to the core of how you and an employee are going to have a successful relationship. And so I would really urge people to take what we're saying to heart, to try to avoid really nasty situations down the road. I say you're going to have more effective employees. I can tell you that from 20 plus years of experience working with companies. You're going to have fewer claims, and it's just a way to really build your staff up. And I would reiterate, don't view this only as a disciplinary measure. I would look at it as in a bigger scope of how you develop the organization and develop the people and make it a positive thing, so that it's there. And when bad things happen, people aren't going to be able to, comply or perform their role. There's a natural movement out of the organization from those things.
Excellent. Thank you. And Dean, here's a question for you. And by the way, remember to put your questions in chat. Independent contractor or employee? I get that question so often. Churches are ambivalent about, aren't sure how they should designate certain employees. Can you help us distinguish between the two?
Yeah, and as I'm hearing you ask the question, I know we've talked about this in some other programs for insurance board. And the one thing that that's coming to mind, which I'll address later, is sort of why we want people putting these relationships in writing, but or some of the things to think about when you do that. But in terms of reaching fork in the road that I've mentioned before in this program. I think I would tell folks, it would probably take an hour for us to walk through every jurisdiction and what the law is in every state. But there is at least one major hallmark of an independent contractor, and that is in the name itself, independence. So independent contractors should be acting with independence in terms of performing the job that they are performing for you. They should be operating with some level of independent discretion and control over the way that they perform their job. There should not be somebody standing over them telling them how to do a particular role. Oftentimes for organizations like those in insurance board, these will be people with specific skill sets outside the organization that are coming in to support an event, a marketing campaign, a giving campaign, graphic artists, vendors that are propping up tents, helping put together some sort of an event, and so forth and so on. The other sort of hallmarks that are worth mentioning that you see in a lot of different jurisdictions would be a sense of permanence with the organization, or put another way, does the individual have a business outside of the work that they do for you? Do they have other clients? Are they engaged in independent trade? Or is somebody working for you 40 hours a week and they've been working 40 hours a week for you for the last 3 years? That sounds like an employee, not an independent contractor. And those are two of the main ones that I would probably mention. Beyond sort of identifying what an independent contractor looks like, I would reiterate some things that we've said to members before in terms of when you do have independent contractors, things that you should think about doing. Number one, put those agreements in writing. Clearly outline what the scope of work is and what the expectations for those independent contractors are. Clearly define the terms of compensation and payment. And then really think about indemnity and insurance. And if somebody's coming into your organization, particularly if they've got their own business and they have their own employees, they should have their own workers' compensation insurance. They should have their own general liability insurance. And they should be willing to attest to the fact that they have those things and be willing to indemnify you, the organization, for anything that they mess up. Particularly if they're doing stuff that could harm, patrons, members of the public that are coming into your facility. So really give some thought to those sort of issues. And I think if you go to the insurance board's resources page, you should be able to see some of those programs that we've done in the past about sort of contracts and managing risk. And there's some tools there that are available to you as well.
There are certain policies around harassment or sexual abuse, boundary training that can be very helpful in protecting people in churches. Can you share a little bit about why such policies are important?
Yeah, so I often, when I'm not being a lawyer, I'm also leading up a baseball softball organization in my local community, and I'm often the target of lawyer jokes about the 2-hour trainings that people get about what you should or shouldn't do around kids. And unfortunately, whether it's religious organizations, sporting organizations, businesses, they've all fallen victim to people doing very bad things and gnarly litigation coming out of it that sours the name of religious organizations, sporting organizations, businesses, hurts reputations, costs lots of money, and harms individuals that are involved. So the chicken and the egg of this is all of these boundary trainings, all of these sexual harassment trainings are really the result of the litigation. It's a risk management tool that lawyers have put in place to try to stop stuff from happening in the first place. And if unfortunately something bad happens or a claim is made, the organization can try to put forth its best case of, look, we can't be everywhere every moment of every day and prevent every bad thing from happening. But what we can do, and what we did do, and here's the evidence of it, because we've got all of this training, we did talk to people about boundary training issues. We did talk with our employees about sexual harassment. We did talk with people about discrimination prevention and what our expectations were. We talked to people about what they should do if they see it happening. We talked with people about what retaliation looks like and what not to do and who to go to within an organization to try to cure some of these things. So hopefully if something bad happens, the fact pattern would be whatever is alleged to have happened, but wherever the organization could have done something, it did. And if nothing was said, then the organization couldn't act to try to prevent it. Or if something was said, an organization on the back end of all of that training and all those policies jumped in to do some investigations as it promised it would do. So some of what is behind me, this is not intended to be a plug, but was the work of going back 6, 7, 8 years ago, before California even had some of these first statutes on the books about sexual harassment trainings being mandated for its employees. We were doing this for businesses and organizations, and we've developed that and created online learning programs that employers can now provide, whether they're required to do it or not. But you're seeing states all across the country that are mandating those sort of trainings. And I would tell any organization that's watching this program, find out if you've got to be doing it. You probably know if you do, but even if you don't, it's pretty cost effective now to train your staff. They can do it remotely. They can do it from their iPhone. They can do it from a laptop. If you want to have an HR professional or a lawyer come in and do it in a classroom setting, that's obviously something that you can do. But there's really low hurdles and thresholds to get over to get people this training in a really cost effective and effective manner. And I would encourage organizations to be doing that. And the same is true for boundaries training. It's for all the same reasons that we're asking organizations to be putting this in place, so that we're communicating those expectations to our religious leaders. We're talking to the people within an organization about what to be looking for, what grooming looks like, where conversations should or shouldn't happening with members of our organizations, and what we want them to do if they see something that looks like the type and kind of thing that we don't want happening in our organization, so we can step in. And it may not be that something bad's happening, but it may just be somebody's not received the training, or they've forgotten it, or they've gotten a little too comfortable with a particular family or an individual, and the organization just needs to step in and say, hey, these are the rules of engagement for us. We really need you to be following those, and then keeping an eye on things on a going forward basis. So it's a huge risk management tool, and it really tracks the logic that I sort of explained with the handbooks and the policies. It's upfront expectations, establishing a policy, hopefully avoiding bad things happening in the first place. And if, God forbid, something bad happens, you've got it there as a risk management tool to say, we tried, we did the best we could. These are the steps we took to try to prevent it from happening. And it's part of our ongoing efforts to try to not be negligent and avoid or turn a blind eye to some of these things that we obviously know happen inside and outside of religious organizations.
And I do believe there is training, Presidium training through Insurance Board, and that there is a model policy for sexual abuse prevention. I believe it's on the Insurance Board website, insuranceboard.org, and I think it's under Safety Central, but I can't swear to that. But I do believe that they have a model policy. That is correct?
Yes, and I'm trying to remember the name of the boundaries training, and it's just escaped me at the moment, but it's there front and center. It's not hard to find when you go onto the site.
Great. Hey, I'm hoping we have time for a couple of just real quick risk prevention questions. They're important. So, I don't want you to be too quick if you have some more to share, but we're hearing so much these days about cybersecurity and social media policies. Social media is a big issue, I know, in so many churches and in so many conferences. Is this something that ministries should have specific policies on? And can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I stole a little bit of our thunder here a moment ago when I was sort of talking about the type and kind of data that religious organizations that may traditionally not view themselves as banking or financial institutions that need to take very strict measures to protect personal data. actually are covered by many of these laws. So we have to be thinking about these things as religious organizations. And just as we sort of mentioned with the handbook, these policies are important to not only set the expectations and communicate what we want people to be doing, but also if there is a breach, we have a protocol in place and we know how to execute on it if something bad happens. Social media is a little bit different. I think there it's more of an expectations piece. In religious organizations, oftentimes there'll be a person or a group of people who are making statements on behalf of a church or a ministry, inviting people from the public in, talking about things that are happening, describing events, maybe even going deeper and describing philosophies of the organization, things like that. It's not unheard of for individuals that are in that capacity to post a picture that's not appropriate or make a statement that's sort of outside the boundaries of what an organization's comfortable saying. And so those social media policies are really important to sort of explain expectations about what we want out there in the universe, what authority an individual has to act on behalf of the organization, and where those limits are, and sort of reiterate to folks beyond what you say to the outside world and the limits to what you can do there. These platforms and their messaging platforms are subject to all of the same policies and procedures for employees that would exist if you were in an office setting. So we've had a lot of cases of sexual harassment or workplace harassment where the bullying or the harassment or the intimidation or the propositioning is happening on social media platforms. And people think, well, I'm not at the office, so I can go harass Jane through Facebook, but that's not the case. And people need to understand it's no different than if Jane's standing in front of you. If you're holding a certain position relative to employment and you're making those sort of statements, they all get put into the bigger mix and can be illegal under our policies or violate our policies. So that's probably what I'd say on those two issues.
Okay, great. And I have just one last question. This past weekend, there was the horrible incident in the synagogue in Texas that we all heard about and saw in the news. Do you think that ministries should have an emergency safety security plan in place for staff and for others, right? Even on Sunday mornings in case of many of our churches?
Yeah. So my short answer is we should at least be thinking about it. I think there's no escaping what's been going on around us in the universe, and some religious organizations in some parts of this country have an acute risk from the surrounding community that something like that might happen. And quite frankly, whether you're a religious organization or a meat packing company or a manufacturing warehouse or a restaurant, I mean, we get stories all the time about disgruntled workers who get terminated that come right back to the workplace and commit violent acts on their staff. I've had to go in and file restraining orders against ex-employees who threaten to commit violence against people when they're let go or whatever the case might be. So no different than somebody who is operating a giant 3-ton piece of machinery that could rip a finger off that presents a workplace risk, or somebody who's working in a mine that could be breathing in coal and inhalation that could hurt their body. These are workplace risks, and OSHA has authority in this area. And if you're in a state like California that has a state organization like Cal OSHA, they're going to have their own positions on this. And these are workplace risks that organizations need to be looking at and identifying what the risk is and how they can take measures to mitigate them. It's really the same theme as what we've been talking about with COVID. What does our environment look like? What is this risk to our employees, and how do we mitigate it? And so you might be doing things like training staff on how to identify one of these sort of violent outbreaks, what an employee struggling with personal issues might look like, and they may bring that into the workplace, or their loved ones or family members may bring that in there. So discussions and trainings around some of those outside risks. If you have a particularly acute risk, then there might be some things that you can do to control certain areas or access to your facilities or your workplaces. Depending on the cost and availability, and again, measuring some of that against how real the risk is, you might put certain security measures in place, panic buttons, secure rooms, security guards at events, larger places where just people do really bad things. And it could be a farmer's market or a giant community event that's being sponsored by one of our ministries. It doesn't matter if a security guard makes sense. What's the cost, and do we protect ourselves and the public by having somebody around there? And then lastly, I would say just again about communicating policy and expectation, having a conversation with employees through our policies and through our trainings and our employee development, that if you see something, we want you to say something, and we want you to bring forward these threats. We want you to let us know when people are struggling, because those little things that, you hear this all the time in news, the people around a particular individual that goes into a school and kills classmates, or a person that goes to work and kills a bunch of coworkers, or somebody that runs into a synagogue and starts taking hostages. There are warning signs, and when people don't say something, you miss an opportunity to sort of get in front of it. So making that part of the policy and the culture of the organization as well.
I know that Elizabeth Vance from Insurance Board has partnered with us and with other entities to provide some active shooter training for some of our churches in the past, which has been very useful and helpful. Dean, Dean, is there anything else that you would like to share with us this afternoon?
No, I just want to thank Insurance Board for having me here again. It's always a pleasure to speak with the members. I hope we're making a dent and helping people think about these things, give them some perspective, maybe scare them into doing some stuff that they maybe would be too busy or might otherwise push down the list of things to do. But really, where we're doing this in January of the year, it's a great time to give some thoughts to these issues. And beyond, being reflective, I would just really urge folks to do whatever you can do to put some of this stuff in action, to not only, avoid the litigation and make a lawyer's job easier if they have to defend you, but really to build up your organization, to make it a better place to work, to really keep your staff engaged and developing them as members of your organization, to make the place run better.
Well, Dean Rocco, I want to thank you so much for being with us here today. I want to thank everyone who has been a part of this webcast. We're going to stay on a little while after the webcast to answer any additional questions that people may have in the live chat. And these questions and answers will be sent to everyone who attended in a follow-up email. If you have additional questions at the conclusion of this webcast, please reach out to Insurance Board, and remember to visit and explore their website at www.insuranceboard.org. This is David Ackerman, again, Penn West Conference Minister. I want to thank you all for being with us today, and blessings to each of you in these beautiful, but here in Western Pennsylvania, chilly January days. Best to all of you. Bye-bye.